this kind of style became acceptable, so that now the party line has thawed to a certain extent, and you find that in Russia, the kind of architecture being built today is ironically up to the year 1964 in the West. In other words, you can see the party line thawing, and the buildings they're building are just about American style, 1964-65. I think it moves at kind of 10 years behind the West, but it moves, and it's rather a caricature of what's happening. Now I'm going to switch to recent developments in England, and on Friday, recent developments in America. I might ask you if you prefer an earlier time. Is that possible, Shelley, to start at 5? How many of you would prefer to start at 5 rather than 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How many would prefer 7 rather than 5? The majority. Okay. Well, we'll start at 7 then. Is 6 better? How many would prefer 6 rather than 7? So it's really... We talked last week, we had a discussion about the dialectic and the way history seems to reoccur in different patterns. And I mentioned this evolutionary tree, which I made the basis for 2 books I've written. This evolutionary tree I developed trying to explain the fact that things seem to reoccur. One kind of time that is cyclical time, and so that, for instance, there tends to be a neoclassical revival in America every 20 or 30 years, or what's called a precisionist strain in modern architecture seems to come back again and again and again. Well, that type of time, historical time, is concerned with revivals, and historians have always speculated on whether it's the essential kind of time or whether it's not. And you know, with theories of the rise and fall of civilizations, you can see that some historians, going right back to Vasari and the Renaissance, have said that all civilizations go through these cycles of archaic periods of birth, which are very straightforward and fundamentalist, and then they develop into a classic period, Baroque, and then some kind of decadent Mannerist period. So you see that in art historical and architectural historical terms, that kind of cyclical time is perhaps the most orthodox way of looking at architectural history. And yet there's another kind of time which is linear or irreversible or technical time, where things develop in a line, the way in which in transportation it's clear that to get to the airplane, for instance, you have to go through several successive stages, which include, for instance, the bicycle and the petrol engine, the car, and the notion of flight. So that kind of linear time also exists in architecture, since it's architecture looks to technology if it's not based on technology. So that the 2 kinds of time are put in this diagram, which is meant to be like an evolutionary tree of species. And you can see that, for instance, the constructivist period, which I talked about last time, waxed as a part of this bubble. And it shared a lot of things with the utopian tradition that was going on in Germany, what was called expressionism. So they formed a large blob, and both of them were rather quickly killed by other architectural species, and most notably, of course, this malevolent beast here, fascism. So that the activist tradition doesn't start coming back again in a new form until you get people like Jane Jacobs and the advocacy planners and so forth. Well, now today I'll be talking about the pop movement of architecture, which I've included here in the intuitive tradition because in many ways the pop architects, such as Archigram, are inheritors of the expressionist tradition, and they design intuitively rather than, say, logically. To work out this tree, I've made use of a semantic space, setting a series of polar opposites, such as intuitive and logical, unself-conscious, self-conscious, and said that there's a tendency of these architectural species or animals to cohere in underlying groups or in, say, around certain ideas or psychological types. So that, for instance, if you're an engineer, you tend to also believe in a kind of functionalism. You have to learn mathematics, you tend to be taught geometry, and you have a series of values, such as valuing service and anonymity and so forth. So that these values and traditions, as it were, tend to keep these species separate from each other. Although, of course, you get borrowings and you get hazy merging of ideas and forms. Well, the pop movement in England is just one of several, and a lot of things happen in what I've called the unself-conscious tradition, which is the tradition perhaps most dear to the British. That is the tradition of the welfare state, of socialism, of the idea of planning. Actually, for reasons of graphing, simplicity, rather than for reasons of an antithesis. It's quite clear that that these things aren't, in fact, as opposite as I've made them in certain cases, and you've just pointed out a way in which there's sometimes they overlap. But in fact, this diagram should be in 3 dimensions, and it should be much more complex than it is. I got the notion from Levi-Strauss, and he discusses spending time in a factory constructing these very elaborate charts in 3 dimensions. And if you saw it in 3 dimensions, you'd see that on one dimension it may be opposite. There may be an opposition, but on the other dimensions, of course, there's a similarity. And what you've got for ease of graphic representation in these 2 diagrams is an oversimplification.
What does fundamentalists apply to in self-conscious school?
The fundamentalist tradition, a return to the ideas that underline architecture are certain fundamental archetypes. For instance, on the one hand, it's Vincent Scully's remark that Lou Kahn seems to discover the fundamentals of architecture, just as Le Corbusier rediscovers it. And it seems to be rediscovered, by every great architect, that there's a square underlying things, or a grid, or something like that. It tends to be oversimplified, for one thing. And fundamentalism in a religious sense also, I mean to suggest here, the kind of mystical fundamentalism and back to nature cult, which is shared in a certain sense by a lot of modern architects. The self-conscious cultivation of the primitive. I mean, it's clear that Lou Kahn's works are, trying as hard as they can be to be naive and uncontaminated by civilized or conventional society. His buildings in Dhaka, for instance, are examples of that. But all of his buildings seem to go back right to the fundamentals and be, like so much modern architecture, a celebration of the noble savage. Well, fundamentalism I actually predicted as a kind of reactionary movement somewhere in the year 2000, because I saw, the way in which the fundamentalism of certain religious sects and the fundamentalism of modern architecture are very similar. They both reject high-tech sophistication and a complex society and want to return really to a very primitive past.
Well, that's kind of ironic because Kahn is, I don't know that much about himself, but he seems to be very, pictures is one of the very slick and advanced people of a high society. Some pictures knock up a building and it seemed like the opposite of what the Bangladesh guy was related to. Like a Martian building to sit down in the restaurants.
Well, there is a tradition in high culture or in Vogue magazine for the primitive. So there's a way in which what you say is correct. But I think Lou Kahn, is Marie Antoinette on playing the farmer or in the dairy. But I think in Lou Kahn's case, it's more profound than that. I mean, he really is a fundamentalist. He believes that, he says, I start from a square always, and then seek forces which are contingent, which disprove the square. So, and sometimes he can't disprove it, so he ends up with a square with a rectangle. I mean, with a triangle cut out of it or something. Very powerful, fundamental, brute forms. Anyway, I might get into that next time more. Now, to show the strange nature of cyclical time and reversible time, these two examples are relevant, because here is an illustration from the bad taste drawer of the Architectural Association library. We have a drawer marked bad examples, bad taste, what not to do, horrors. And it shows suburban disorder, urban monotony, and street chaos, right? And this example was illustrated in Architectural Review and put in the drawer at the A2 in about 1950 to show what not to do. You know, and what you shouldn't do is really what Los Angeles has done, right? In other words, it's fantasy here, semi-detached baronial, Edwardian romantic. Maybe I can focus that. Whoops. Modernistic bungaloid. You recognize that, Chez Nous. Or urban monotony. Well, this is Britain more than it is America, with the rising gasometers in the background. And this is the high street of, this is also Oxford Street, or the small town in England. So, and maybe it's Santa Monica. I don't know. But anyway, it's examples of what not to do. And it's interesting, that's 1950, and this is archigram about 1970. So 20 years later, the shoe is on the other foot, and the dialectic has come full circle, and Peter Cook is celebrating cheek-by-jowl schemes, the metamorphosis of our town from a nice cheek-by-jowlism here to even more of a hodgepodge here. Justifying this not only from the point of visual excitement and the aesthetic pleasure of doing these strange mole hills, and I don't know if you've heard Peter recently, but he's into things like sludge and lump, doing these strange things, but also very consciously seeing that, this is the life of the city, as polemicized by Jane Jacobs, saying that there's an economic reason for our cities being chaotic, for being old, a mixture of new and old buildings and so forth, that it allows uneconomic activities to get off the ground and have a start, whereas, the more integrated aesthetics and integrated cities stifle that grassroots capitalism and grassroots creativity, so that, the life of the city is like this, and like this, and this. So that there are other, more, maybe deeper reasons for the change in philosophy by 1970. But looking at the background for most of what happens in England, you see that right after the war, with the bombing of London, a lot of the center of London was destroyed. The Architectural Review put out a series of articles on what to do in reconstruction. And they said, what we must have is constructive compromise, not tabula rasa. That's what the situation calls for. And so they formulated what's called the Townscape philosophy in a series of nice little pencil sketches by Gordon Cullen, rather like the later, preempting the work of Helmut Jacobi, these little hairy, almost herringbone sketches of grass and street furniture and pebbles and kiosks and that sort of thing. He makes these parts of the environment look like herringbone or something that you'd wear, very kind of cosmetic architecture. Well, this philosophy of townscape is adopted by the Architectural Review, and they put it in opposition to the continent and to rationalism, and particularly to Le Corbusier. They say, what we don't want is the tabula rasa of Le Corbusier. We want a picturesque aesthetic which can absorb everything and which is a kind of urban cosmetics. So that the first essays in industrialization, the building of schools, the famous Hertfordshire schools, which Sir Robert Matthew and others in the LCC start designing, are, in a sense, wooden sheds made up of prefabricated elements, but they're designed in a picturesque way. And they're placed in picturesque parks, And they're designed with a careful asymmetry, pitched roofs, and sort of cozy nooks and crannies. This becomes very consciously the philosophy of most of Britain. And the Architectural Review says we must build up a case book method along the system of law, where you send out precedents, not principles. You send them out to the country, and then every local council will follow these precedents and follow this type of design. So the Hertfordshire schools are, in a way, the symbol of the welfare state, the symbol of mass production, the symbol of the fact that the Labour Party won the 1945 election and stayed in power till 1951. Really underline that whole hope and desire of maybe 50 to 100 years of British socialism. So they come into power, the Labour Party comes into power, and they start producing schools as a symbol of their social intentions. Well, the Hertfordshire School is very important also because they influence California's schools. You know that Ezra Ehrenkrantz and others studied these systems, and they produced the SCSD system here in 1965. Ezra went to Cambridge and studied these systems. Well, the early systems mutate and mutate and mutate until there are thousands of them on the market, and they ultimately become what's known as the clasp system of more heavyweight construction. It's a prefabricated concrete method of building, and the British start building their new universities with this. In fact, it's not only the new schools that show the new Labour Britain, but the new universities and, of course, the 20 or 30 new towns constructed after the war. This is York University by Robert Matthew, so from this to this is same author. And you can see it's put in a traditional English landscape park here, one that goes right back to the 18th century, to Pope's famous dictum, consult the genius of place in every design, the genius loci. That this was in fact an 18th century park, and so they put these mass-produced right-angled buildings in that environment, but they break them up into very nice, nicely scaled series of student rooms set amongst weeping willows and lakes. Kind of an idyllic ideal. Well, the 25 or so new towns are started right after the Second World War. They go through also transformations, just as these building systems do. There's Mark I new towns, Mark II, Mark III, named probably after the Jaguar Mark I and Mark VII and Mark IX. And this is a Mark II new town. It's based and even drawn here in the Townscape method. You can see it's a very picturesque compilation of prefabricated elements. There's the pebbles and the stones in the drive. Here is the separation of pedestrian from the vehicle. Here are the nice little backyards. And the whole thing captures that flavor, which ultimately goes back to Camillo Sitte's town planning according to artistic principles. That is to say, it's supposed to be experienced as a symphony, some kind of a symphony of crescendos, of axes, and nice experiences. Well, this, of course, as you can guess from my tone, is hated by a lot of the other English architects. The rationalists, people like Jim Sterling and so on, find it too cute and without any intellect or attention in it. And so there's a movement that starts against it. Before I get to that, though, let me point out its crowning masterpiece here, the Royal Festival Hall, designed by Sir Leslie Martin and Robert Matthew and others, in the LCC. It's designed in the LCC. And it symbolizes the introduction of modern architecture into Britain on a public level. It's the first really large building in the modern style. So it's not until 1951 that the English really get modern architecture, whereas other countries have had it for 20 years. It's very slow in arriving in Britain, and it's disliked on many levels. other words, you get terrific attacks against modern architecture in the 20s and say, let's keep Le Corbusier out of this country as much as we can. Anyway, here he's arrived. Corbusier sue Leslie Martin. It's the building as ship. The Festival of Britain was meant to be in the ship style, and everything was meant to bring that out. So they had these masts of ships here. You see cantilevering over the Thames River, and you arrived by boat on these sort of jetties and docks. And then you went into the festival hall to hear a symphony under these forms, which were meant to remind you of the decks of a ship and so forth. The whole thing in sort of like a white ocean liner in the Corbusian manner.
Like a warehouse.
It's like a warehouse now, but to them it looked like a ship, or at least that's the journalistic cliche. Well, you can see some other constructive compromises involved in the imagery. For instance, the royal cartouche here of the Queen, something that obviously to the socialists and Marxists at the GLC would have caused them to gag a bit. And the whole aesthetic itself being a compromise of Corbusier, the flattened gesture. You know, if you know Corbusier's curves and you know how he handles plastic shapes, they're much more powerful than this in 1950. And it is, you know, it's British restraint getting the better of Corbusian aggression. So, you know, the serious modern architects groaned and said, God save us from this nausical whimsy, which is nauseating. That's what they called nautical imagery, is nautical whimsy.
Was that opposed by the political left, who were in control of?
No, the political left, the Labour Party stayed in power until 1951, and they were very much in favor of the Festival of Britain. So they were not against that aesthetic at all. In fact, with this building, lucky that it's come on the right moment, just to make the point, this is the kind of building they approved of. It's Roehampton East, as opposed to Roehampton West, which they didn't like so much, although the left was divided on this score. The Roehampton East was designed by the LCC, members of the LCC, who were getting their party lines straight out of Moscow from Zadnov. Zadnov said, proletariat housing will be 4 stories brick, have pitched roof, and balconies and geraniums and so forth. So the British socialist architects in the GLC, who also had a precedent for this, and William Morris, you know, built out of brick, and the whole arts and crafts movement was homespun and domestic and small scaled. They could look both to Zadnov and Russia, and they could look to their past. Well, this is called the People's Detailing. It was called the People's Detailing in the GLC, the LCC, it was then the LCC, and it was both defended and attacked. It's interesting to compare the scheme, which was considered so awful by the people who designed this, Howell, Killick, and Partridge, a group of architects in the GLC. Because they're built at the same time, they form a nice laboratory of cultural comparison. This is the intellectual scheme, which has rigor, kind of high culture design, and certain integrity. It's, as you can see, a series of Le Corbusier slabs on an English rolling landscape here. Again, another converted country house. And these slabs are lifted above the rolling countryside on pilotis. They're a series of double height living spaces within more or less the geometry and kind of technical precast concrete aesthetic of Le Corbusier. When Kidder Smith, the American, came to England and looked at the scheme, he said this is without doubt the best housing in Europe produced since the war. And it was internationally celebrated. This, I mean, everybody came to visit. Even the Russians and Swedes came and looked at Roehampton and said, wow, that's what it's all about. That's what the modern movement means. So, you know, everybody smiled in the GLC at this and sort of said, that's not so good. But with the passage of another 20 years, the screw has turned full circle, and it's clear that this is mellowing much better and that people like this kind of thing because of its domestic scale. And, well, you hear all sorts of obscene tales about homosexuals being killed in this scheme, and, you know, it's being unsafe to walk within a half a mile of it. the Oscar Newman syndrome. You know, they're all the BBC makes films about the horrors of living in that one, and I don't know. It is rather shocking to confront the difference and really feel that this one is much more successful as housing, even though perhaps intellectually, in terms of design integrity, this one has much more to it. So Zhdanov may have been right after all. Anyway, another example of the dialectic.
What is?
Yeah, go back.
What was the main? The people actually lived in that one. They didn't like it at all. What was their main criticism?
Well, for one thing, it wasn't built as Le Corbusier intended. It didn't have any social facilities. They don't like to walk, you know, through a windswept, open, albeit beautiful landscape park to get their groceries. And I'm not sure about local facilities in this one, but at least they're closer to the ground. They don't have to go through lifts, and there aren't these long corridors and anonymous spaces, which are just really architectural spaces. I mean, you know, nothing happens underneath this building.
Or on top either.
And on top, nothing happens either. So that the kind of rationale which Corbusier had for it, that is many social functions, wasn't carried out. But even if they had been, it seems to me that this does not signify a house or home or all of the kind of domestic meanings that people clearly want, especially in England. Whereas they might not mind that in a more urban kind of situation. This signifies, you know, social deprivation. It signifies the wrong side of the tracks. It signifies that the council didn't have enough money to spend on us, whereas this signifies at least they tried, even if they didn't have enough money. Anyway, the new towns are built in this aesthetic and not in that. So the local authorities do pick up the message from Architectural Review. And that forms the background for the other series of positions. Now, one of them is, of course, the position of Le Corbusier. There are certain architects, such as Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond, who've got very large practices, who designed the biggest single batch of post-war housing in one area in perhaps Europe, I'm not sure. It's a redevelopment project called the Barbican, which has gone on building now since 1955. They've been building. The slowness of this project has something to do with you know, the British laborers' love of going slow. So perhaps that's why it's still a building. But it is a gigantic scheme in a bombed-out area in the city of London, meant for low-cost housing, and of course occupied by middle income and the rich, ultimately. Another paradox involved here. The price of these apartments is prohibitively high, even though they're subsidized. Well, there are very nice things in it, such as these viewing pools, I suppose, and places to sit under pergolas and hear the water splash down through these large Corbusian-like, you know, water troughs. And then the kind of Corbusian image of a street and a city, you know, one of his drawings, it could almost be realized by his disciple. Many architects self-consciously design homages to Le Corbusier, and the Barbican is one of them. Well, it has all of the things that CM talks about: separation of pedestrian. You don't see any pedestrians in this, but they would be there, and vehicles, which are 2 or 3 levels below. The thing is very much a concrete bastion or fortress, and very much underused. These levels are, you know, there are absolutely no shops on them, so the wind uses it, and people bicycle through these kind of caverns. But it's not a very happy. These more expensive houses below here some of them have garden areas outside. Okay, that's the Barbican. Now, that's the kind of architecture which the Architectural Review was against, and they said, let's not have the old Boer Plato, the Platonic architecture, which is designed on principles and rational straight lines and so on. Let's have significant differentiation. Since a good Englishman is a Darwinist, he knows that everything in nature is different. Therefore, every little, you know, building should be different and unplatonic. The kind of European modernism, and you get in 1967, for instance, these very elegant television sets built by the GLC in Elgin Road. It's the Elgin Road Apartments. 2 or 3 of these high towers designed out of fiberglass, GRP, glass reinforced fiberglass, the first GRP buildings in England, with their rounded windows and rubber gaskets and so forth. Interestingly enough, this technology taken from the ambulance of the GLC. This is where because they had GRP ambulances, they just stacked them all up on each other and built it. Again, a kind of thing that archigram and a lot of architects get very excited by, but the inhabitants rather unhappy with their equation with railroad cars and television sets and so forth. Not very popular. Same is true of Thamesmead, which is undergoing extraordinary changes now. You may have seen it in Stanley Kubrick's film Clockwork Orange. He uses this futurist city as, you know, his version of what year 2001 will have in store for us. And he he films it full of litter and graffiti and social anomie. It's not only that. I mean, it's a very nice piece of reinforced concrete, precast concrete. The large towers sort of going down the street, rather like Sant'Elia's drawings of the center of Milan in the year 2000, you know, with those nice bridges across it, and very well ordered, and quite an exciting aesthetic. But in fact, the technology costing a lot of money, and this over-separation between vehicle and pedestrian causing, again, the situation to be perhaps lacking in a certain city life.
Could you say a bit about the GLC and how they get work, how that whole process is public?
The GLC is the largest public architect's office in the world, in fact. And they get work, I'm not sure how exactly. I mean, they make it. They have a certain budget. It's called the Greater London Council now. It was the... what was it before? The LCC, what does that mean? London County Council before. So it's been in existence for 100-something years. And
is it competitive with people who are in private practice, or does it give work out to people?
First of all, its buildings cost more than local authority and people in private practice often. For instance, this building this Thamesmead, although they set up a factory on the site, and they use a Swedish prefabrication method of heavyweight concrete slabs, you can see that, you know, the size of the precasting elements is enormous. In spite of the fact of setting up a factory and using the most advanced techniques and having, you know, a known necessity of constructing a certain amount of them, they find that their cost is something like a third to a half more than traditional brick construction. So the irony is that now the latest part of Thamesmead is being built out of brick. You know, they've returned, even though they have total control on the building system, and they know that who the client is, and they know that there shouldn't be any interruptions.
I wondered if it was anything like in concept, anything like the Urban Development Corporation. It obviously does more than, I mean, it builds stuff as well. But do they give out work? They give out a lot of work. In fact, they give work to private.
That's right. A lot of the architects I'll be showing you depend on the GLC for jobs. I mean, they throw off what they can't handle, and they throw it off to the best architects, or in a sense, the best architects. They throw work at the Smithsons, for instance. The Smithsons are the first polemicists to strike out against the architectural review and constructive compromise, and they, of course, look to the Europeans, and particularly Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier for their principles. So their first work, constructed or designed when they're students together from Newcastle, when they're very young, 24, 5, is Staunton School, finished in 1954. And when it's finished, it causes a terrific stir in the international press, not only in the English press. Philip Johnson, Philip Johnson comes over and really admires it as an essay that Mies would have liked to sign. It's a very rigorous opposition between steel painted black and exposed, enclosing a kind of white engineering or beige engineering brick. The whole school, it's Staunton School, having this ominous water tank as its symbol instead of a clock or a steeple or something that maybe a child or his parent or her parent could identify with. It's this functional industrial object taken from a catalog. This is a ready-made water tower and displayed there like a jewel in a sense. But this realism, and that's what brutalism amounts to in first instance, the realism towards the industrial situation, is very much disliked by the young students who inhabit this building or use it, or are age 10 years old, who have no appreciation for the kind of rigors and poetry of the modern movement. For instance, the brick is left fair-faced and untreated, unstuccoed, unpainted, and the interiors, which are on a Palladian rational plan, even on a mathematical, ordered, symmetrical plan, have very large open spaces. For instance, this is a large congregation area with, hard surface concrete on all four sides. You can imagine when the children are let loose screaming in this reverberant, tough surface, why it's maybe one wishes that brutalism wasn't quite so realistic towards industrial society. Also, for instance, in the toilets, I don't know if these are the toilets here, they have open drains. They just, the Smithsons say, let's, wash basin and a drain pipe are beautiful things. They're sculptural objects. They're mass-produced. Le Corbusier has taught us the beauty of this thing. So let's just expose them and put them on a pedestal, as it were. Well, children come in to wash their hands and aren't, they don't see it as poetry. Again, they see it as social deprivation. So you have a kind of natural schism between elitist architecture and in the name of the people and what the people in fact like. This Staunton is designed according to Palladian principles, and it's part of the movement known as the New Palladianism in England, which starts in opposition to the previous position which I've been talking about, the New Empiricism. So they listen to Colin Rowe, they listen to Rudolf Wittgauer, they listen to people who are talking about the Renaissance and Palladio's design, and they see that as as something they can follow. So you get in the academies, particularly like Cambridge and Oxford, you get a lot of buildings designed according to Neo-Palladian principles. This particular building is by Leslie Martin and Peter Hodgkinson and Colin St. John Wilson, Sandy Wilson, who the three of them come together and decide to build this rather hieratic and beautiful dormitory for students. It's called Keyes College, but it's spelled C-A-I-U-S. Keyes College in Cambridge, and you can see it's a giant entablature here. In plan, it's an absolute square building. And the entablature broken by a very few windows at the top, and then other rooms slung below it. In fact, it's a series of bedrooms put on an angle and slung in this very large brick-piered system. You can pick up, one of the favorite architects of this group is not only Corbusier and the Rationalists, but Alvar Aalto. So it's as if you did Corbusier in the Alto aesthetic. It's a humanist aesthetic exterior, but very much of a rationalist kind of building. I'm sure it's the kind of building that the rationalists in Italy now look on as a forerunner to their work and illustrate. Well, the architects at Cambridge, always exhibiting this brilliant good taste and sparse formality, justify it because they say it's extendable. So all of a sudden the word extendable and impermanent and flexible come into the language of architecture. They say, you can add on to this building by adding, see it's got this blank wall here, by adding another square building that goes off on the other way to its corner. So that's what they say justifies this. Well, that doesn't wash to a lot of Englishmen, such as Cedric Price, who looks at it and says contemptuously that it's basically just the Middle Ages plus 13 ampere points, what do you call them? Sockets for, it's basically the traditional medieval form with a little bit of electric lighting. Anyway, this tradition goes on, and the Neoplatonic and Neopalladian tradition culminates, in a sense, in this building on the south bank by Denis Lasden, who's very much a follower of Le Corbusier. Lasden designs the National Theatre, just recently finished. It took 10 years to build, or more, but it was designed about 1963. It's a series of very elegant reinforced concrete trays, which are meant to be kind of like geological strata holding people between concerts or between performances. And you get other examples of the rationalist tradition. Peter Hodgkinson goes on from Cambridge to design this building in London. It's the Brunswick Centre. Designed in a series of lines, two lines, one here and one here, incorporating these kind of greenhouse glazing details for the living rooms. In fact, they're an extension to the living room, but they're part of the living room. So in fact, it's the old British tradition of saying, let's have a conservatory on the house. But unlike the British traditional system, putting it in such a way that, of course, it bakes the people in the living room, overheats them rather considerably. Anyway, Hodgkinson, with the kind of rigor that only a rationalist or Mussolini would apply to design, produces the largest entry in England, the largest front door that anyone has seen outside of the stadium in, say, Florence. And designs in this, again, an aesthetic which the architects love, but the people somehow haven't risen to. You can see the futurist images here of these smokestacks above service cores, above elevator shafts, and you can see the long interior cantilevers suspended off these really Piranesi-like structural members. Well, when Hodgkinson is asked why he designed this building, he says things, we can now prove mathematically that people live better in lines than they do in other forms. So you get these very esoteric justifications coming from Cambridge and from the Academy, saying that, in fact, you can put more people on the ground in 4 or 5 story linear buildings than you can in high-rise buildings. So this illustrates another change in the dialectic from high-rise building to high-density low-rise. And people in the same tradition, the Neopalladian tradition, people like Cahoon and Miller, designing these very rigorous essays in reinforced concrete. This is a chemistry building in Holloway College, recently finished, 1973. You can see how much this owes actually to the continent and how much it's against the British grain. A lot of these things are attacked, in fact. Another school in the same tradition, designed by a girl, Eldred Evans, by a very young girl, has a kind of the same very strong organizational qualities to it. This is the Newport School in Wales, finished a year ago, or 2 years ago. Eldred Evans being a friend, very good friend and pupil of Jim Sterling, good friend of Alan Cahoon, a friend of Colin Rowe. So very much in that tradition. Well, some of the people who attack this kind of work are the Fabian socialists, who say this is not at all well suited to school building. And the Smithsons themselves start reversing position. Instead of designing symmetrical buildings which are organized on mathematical principles, look for a new form of organization, and they come up with a topographical form. They study the new principles of topology and see that it makes more sense to wrap a building around the site and just change it according to local conditions than to go to abstract formal systems. So they get these snake buildings. And what they are designed very much on are the mechanical equipment here coming out of the power plant and lines of service. Well, this is the brutalist image par excellence, and it produces such, it leads to such things as this housing in Park Hill in Sheffield, housing which is designed by the Corporation of Sheffield to supplant the working class housing down here. It's torn down, the working class back-to-back housing is torn down, and the people are put in these high-rise curvilinear barracks. Well, the architect for this studied with Smithson and said, "I'm proud to say I never designed the facades." You see, this becomes a positive virtue in the brutalist game, because they consider aformality and a realism towards the situation as being preferable to any aesthetic preconceptions, or so they say. I mean, of course, there are many aesthetic preconceptions evident here, but they are trying to go to a studied informality and, if you like, randomized design. I mean, think of this as the time of Jackson Pollock paintings, when Jackson Pollock is very big in England, at least in the among this group, and they think of it as a kind of action architecture, which results from just simply the placement of certain kitchens, bathrooms, and so forth. Banham has recently defended the scheme, and what he says is that according to Newman's theories of defensible space and violence, this should be a high-rise slum with a lot of vandalism, but in fact it isn't. The street decks, although they aren't working very well, are not vandalized, and in fact there isn't any graffiti. And he says the reason for this, and the reason that Newman's ideas aren't quite right, is that this corporation, when they rehoused the people, took a very active involvement with them, and simply because they interviewed everybody and administered it in a very humanistic way, it got over any kind of determinisms in the architecture. So Banham is still defending this as architecture, and it still plays a kind of very important role in thinking. There are other essays in the same brutalist aesthetic. You can see where, Corbusier's definition of architecture as the by means of brutal materials establishing emotional relations leads to this kind of brutalism. I mean, it's his aesthetic and his definition of béton brut and brutal relationships. Here is a kind of mass housing as a castle, and other people have tried to transform it into their view of home with a little green picket fence and green siding. This is by Hal Killick Partridge, by the way, the same group that did Roehampton, and you'll keep seeing their work. In fact, here is, just after that, Howell started teaching at the AA. In fact, his other partners did, and Howell was teaching a member of Archigram, who was a student then, who was doing a building which, well, it was what was his name? There's the one member of Archigram who's always in the United States, so I can't remember his name. But he was a student of Howell, and he produced the erupted skin. It was called the erupted skin architecture. Ronchamp had just been designed, and a lot of buildings were beginning to appear. This is 1959. So that Howell looks at his students' work, which is in the shape of lumps and tubes and ultimately bowels. That's what it was called, Bowelism, because it looked like your stomach and so forth. So Howell produced this, and this was called Howellism, as a kind of a howler of the erupted skin. It's getting away from the one-dimensional facade. It's definitely exploding it out and trying to give the student individual expression. Each study bedroom would have, this erupted skin, place for him to stand and sleep. So this, and you can see the two buildings curve, is built as student housing in Oxford in about 1960. So that students start influencing modern architects. And the dialectic turns again and again and again. Finally, people like the Smithsons, who had also been teaching at the A and who had been putting forward the idea of brutalism and the house of the future and really advanced futurist imagery, all of a sudden turn about 180 degrees and start going backwards to designing buildings which they say are designed on Beatrix Potter and designed on, cute corners and picturesque detailing. That's the way they see it. So by 1965, this is St. Hilda's College in Oxford, the Smithsons have completely reversed fields and even hire Gordon Cullen to do the renderings for this. So they adopt the Townscape philosophy and almost the people's detailing. Because, in fact, archigram has outflanked them on the technological front, and they turn against that sort of view. This is an example of the other things that's going on, is what's called the formalism of the British avant-garde. It's a building in Cambridge, the New Hall in Cambridge, designed about 1966 in this very white Mediterranean style, recalling the light catchers of Ronchamp and the domes of Byzantine architecture. It's in fact a restaurant, a dining hall for girls in Cambridge, and they nicknamed this dome, or really it looks more like an observatory, they nicknamed it the New Tit because of its obvious similarity with the breast. So you find these kind of epithets appearing now in print as an indication of where the new imagism has moved and what the kind of ideas and metaphors that architects are being led to by really the crisis of rationalism and crisis of the modern movement. Well, now finally, after all so much cynicism and so forth, get to an architect who I like, Stirling, and although I'll just quickly pass over his work because I think it's very well known in Los Angeles now. Stirling, a nice portrait of him here outside his house in his garden, showing him the typical sophisticate noble savage that he is, stepping, his Liverpool background here. His father was a shipbuilder, so he always keeps a kind of one foot in the Industrial Revolution and the other foot on sort of an Easter egg here with his desert boots. He lives in Hampstead, so he's got one foot in each culture. You can see what a sensitive man he is with this little bamboo pointer here and his face, but you can see what a roughneck he is too. So I think in that portrait you can see why he produces these buildings which are, in a way, the ultimate poetry of an industrial society. Here's 4 or 5 different buildings that he's done, designed on the axonometric technique. Very important technique because it allows him to see the geometry and the structure in 3 dimensions in a true way without any distortion. So from this type of design comes his aesthetic. Extraordinary to find this building, the Leicester Engineering Building, in Britain in 1964, since so much of the work being done at that time was one of compromise and watering down things. Here's all of a sudden Stirling, who, without any compromise whatsoever, produces these very strange geometries set at 45 degrees to each other, which look like almost an iceberg, or look like you can't tell the material. For instance, it's again a kind of GRP and glass. The end of the building, this is in fact the last level of the warehouse space, which is cantilevered out above the area for trucks to drop off heavy equipment and have it be raised through elements in the lower floor here, raised up on jacks. This shape, it's cut out shape, punched out shape, very exciting shape, being apparently generated by function. This is what Stirling does. When he exhibits his buildings, he shows how rational it all is, that it's all generated by circulation of trucks and climbs up the ramps and vertical circulation, and for instance, those funny saw-toothed icebergs are generated by the north lighting, you see, which all of the things are turned away from the sun, so they catch indirect light. Everything in the building apparently having a functional justification, and that's why he shows diagrams like this in showing his building. Well, this building caused terrific furor in England, annoying all of the older generation like Nicholas Pevsner, because they thought it was willful and too expressionist. It seems to me that one of the reasons it annoyed them was that it was made up of that building and this later one at Oxford were made up of very strange shapes that were calculatedly dissonant and almost even ugly. Look at this, for instance, these 11.5 degrees, 22.5 degrees angles, columns which just come right out of the building in a literal way and support what looks like a stadium. In fact, it's another residence for students. These angles and tensions are, and the use of, say, Dayglow green handrails, or the way that, look at the way that rhythm of a stair comes down and hangs out precipitously over the outside of the tile skin. All of that is meant to gnash the teeth and put you on edge and, really excite you the way a Stravinsky symphony is to excite you. Well, the older generation just found it too exciting and hated it. So poor Jim Sterling is condemned as a prima donna and as an anti-functionalist. So ultimately he ends up out of work, or having very little work in England. One of his last buildings is the Olivetti Training Centre, designed as an attachment to a country house, an Edwardian country house in the south of England. And it's made up of GRP units which stretch over the roof and the wall here, series of teaching offices with this extraordinary glass flared link here, and another very strange shape here, this auditorium, the ultimate Olivetti play gadget with movable walls that, at the press of a button, is a terrific command module in this building right here. All these walls can raise and lower, thus creating a large auditorium space, even one that comes out into this space, or a very small one. Well, you can again see, there's 11.5 degrees angle. You can see the kind of tensions involved in that. Everything, it's a kind of architecture which looks to be very classical because it's on a podium, it's highly geometric, but then it breaks all the easy, harmonious symmetries and plays a kind of very delightful game. One of the games it plays in the interior is, for instance, this perspective trick game. Ultimately, it's a Baroque or Mannerist space where you look one way and it's twice as long as looking the other way, although, of course, the distance is the same. He achieves this by flaring out the glazed link in 3 dimensions so that you can see this, for instance, this mechanical equipment appears to be coming at you as you walk down the ramp, but the same distance of the ramp up looks a mile away, so it takes much greater effort to walk up the ramp than to come down. Well, you can see what a delightful game, these radiator elements, for instance, being supports for climbing plants. This is actually, it's apple green. It looks yellow, but it's apple green. And this is Dayglow violet. That's the color combination he wanted throughout the building. But in fact, the authorities told him that those two colors, if they were on the exterior, would frighten the birds. So he went through 17 different color changes until he ended up with a combination, and I'm not kidding, of mushroom and Cotswold stone, because Cotswold stone, is the traditional building material of houses in Britain. In spite of the fact this isn't anywhere near the Cotswolds. So Sterling has his troubles. Anyway, the next move of the dialectic is the pop movement. Part of it Sterling is involved in, but Sterling very much also in the Neo-Palladian tradition, doesn't really fully go into it. It starts in the schools at the RCA, and starts with people like Rainer Banham and Richard Hamilton, the painters, meeting every so often in 1954 and looking at things that were attacked previously in the Architectural Review. The Architectural Review put out two issues, one in 1950 called The Mess That Is Man-Made America, in which they illustrated car dumps and Route 1 in Florida and, well, just anywhere in Las Vegas or Los Angeles would do, and said, this, is a disaster. We must never follow the Americans. In 1955, they put out another issue called Machine-Made America, which is still a semi-attack on the whole situation of advanced technology and the consumer society and throwaway technology. So it's still moralistically against it. And then they start a campaign called Subtopia, an outrage. And a man, and Gordon Cullen of all people, writes, is it Gordon Cullen? Someone else maybe, but writes, Ian Nairn, writes for 13 years his daily column called Outrage. So he's outraged for 13 years at that. And you can see what's happening. While he's being outraged, the pop artists are sharpening their tools and beginning to say, hey, anything that anyone hates so much must be good. So they start taking the same photographs and changing the captions. And they start celebrating this. And for instance, Banham starts looking at it in industrial design and engineering and technology and lifts up the hood of a Citroën or other cars and says that's the reality of the machine aesthetic, not the surface, not the sleek forms of Le Corbusier. It isn't, Corbusier's definition of volumes, simple platonic volumes seen in light and shadow. That's not the machine. What the machine is basically a complete jumble, messy compromise of pragmatic requirements having nothing to do with logic, really. They just all have to do with expediency. You decide where to put that where there's room. And it has nothing to do with beauty, and it's ephemeral and changing. So Banham celebrating this kind of willful nihilism of the machine aesthetic, and all the pop artists getting very excited by that. So they really invert all the traditional humanist values in 1954, in these early meetings. And so the pop movement starts, and it starts with people like Richard Hamilton, who puts together this first pop painting, 1956, and the homage, well, that's a pop collage, this is the first pop painting, homage to the Chrysler Corporation, 1957. This one is called, interestingly enough, this is the long title, Just What Is It Today That Makes Our Home So Appealing, So New? And he tries to put, show exactly what it is that makes our houses so appealing. It's a Ford lampshade. It's someone like Marilyn Monroe falling back here. It's on the couch, on a kind of couch. It's ham. It's tinned ham. It's television sets. Young romance. I mean, imagine this is 8 years before Liechtenstein. It's your grandfather's portrait, probably false. It's Al Jolson, and it's, of course, the He-Man with a popsicle. It's a recording. It's all this gimmickry technology. It's recording tapes. And look, it's even moonshots. This is 1956, so he's actually, it's extraordinary how much of an anthropologist Richard Hamilton is. He predicts the obsessions of the next, till 1970. He's got them, most of them here. And then there's this figure, which shows a piece of money can only just buy. So the pop aesthetic and the pop philosophy comes into being, and it's interesting that it's formulated by Englishmen, not Americans. The pop movement's really never philosophized about by Americans. Marshall McLuhan is part of this group. Well, he's Canadian, I guess. They give lectures to each other, and they say, let's look at Detroit, Madison Avenue, and Hollywood, because we find that all of us as children have grown up with this culture as our common everyday culture, and it's only despised and hated by the elitists. But to us, if we look at ourselves like anthropologists might look at us, this is our common language, so why can't we turn it into an art and celebrate it? So then Hamilton collects all of the elements of, say, a Chrysler advertisement. He smashes them up, he paints them with an airbrush, and he reduces them. So this is actually a portrait of a woman here engaged in affectionate display for the car. You can just make out her breast there and the exquisite form broad diagram truncated here, her lips and her curves, which are taken up, of course, by the designers in Detroit and reincorporated in the Chrysler. Banham gives a talk on how these car stylists work and how their aesthetic is an aesthetic of expendability. So Banham really goes the full way, and he says, you know, this is the one thing that the humanist culture and the book culture can't stomach. It's the high rate of obsolescence and expendability, because we envision an aesthetic that will change every month or every day, or even yesterday. It changes so fast, and no one will like this, he says, gloating. Well, the pop movement then takes on an aesthetic form, and it's quite different. It's reborn in 1960 and 61, and it's reborn first by pop painters at the Royal College of Art. It's born in this country by pop painters about 1960, who aren't at all aware of these developments in England, and don't have any philosophy, really. I mean, they just do it. Alan Jones, for instance, designing furniture here in different sort of extreme fetishistic poses, and with leather and rubber and so on chairs to sit in, or mannequins to hold up your coat, or so on. This illustration by Norman Parkinson, the royal photographer, showing Alan Jones, two ready-mades and his wife reading the paper. It's an extraordinary piece of double entendre, appearing in Vogue magazine in 1967. So it shows you what, you know, when it's incorporated. No, sorry, a little bit later, about 1970. This is what Archigram produces. Archigram number 5, in about 1964, 65, does its pop work, looking at comic strips, looking at obvious Buck Rogers and 1930s futurism and expressionism, looking at Buckminster Fuller and all of this oil technology. When they produce this, there is radical change in the other people I've been talking about. The Smithsons really say this is the end, this is disaster. We can't celebrate technology this way. It's the wrong way to go, because the interesting thing about modern technology is it makes no noise, and it should be silent. We should get it under control and put it out of sight. We shouldn't celebrate it like this. This is a mistake, they say. But Archigram, of course, doesn't listen to the Smithsons at all, in spite of the fact that they were their teachers, and they go on their happy way doing exactly what they want. And Archigram is a free-floating team of different people, some of whom are absent, like Warren Chalk and this other fellow whose name keeps escaping, Mike Webb, that's his name, Mike Webb. You probably know them. Ron Heron, Dennis Crompton, Peter Cook, David Green, Colin Fournier. Various people come in and out. Producing Plug-in City in 1964, which is described in very Tom Wolfian terms by Rainer Banham as a city that finally, Plug-in City finally gave architects the equivalent, the visual equivalent of a language which got the excitement and dynamism of change, and the idea of things being brought about, plugged in like a Meccano set on with some kind of traveling cranes, really gave them that poetry which they didn't have before. So the sheer visual exhilaration of a city like this, quite apart from its content, was so strong that it dominated most of the schools for the next 6 years. you get schemes like this one of Ron Heron's, the walking city, envisioned affectionately as a bug-eyed monster city that walks and clomps across the world, holding such things as the United Nations. He conceived that this monster would go to, say, Israel and stand on the border between the Israelis and the Arabs and adjudicate while they had a dispute. So it would be, a movable United Nations. Obviously designed on World War II gun emplacements. When Ron Heron produced this in 1965, there was a really violent outcry. Siegfried Gideon attacked it, Peter Hall attacked it, everybody. Doxiotis said these war machines will crush us like tanks, and we've got to not look at archigram for the the seeds of the future. So, and I can remember students actually in England at the time when students themselves said this is the most fascist architecture we've ever seen. Ron Heron, who's a very sweet, nice, gentle fellow who wouldn't harm a flea, was amazed at the reaction to this. I mean, he just liked his bug-eyed monster. He'd grown up with them as children. He played with them. He couldn't understand what all the shouting was about. Again, the sheer visual invention of them is very nice. I mean, the way they take over, say, the fuller tensile and structures and the structures of Frei Otto and marry them to the flexing tentacles of say, a telescope. Telescope cities. Cities based on every possible metaphor they start designing. Cities that spring open like telescopes and turn into umbrellas. Computer cities. Cities that squeak and change and so forth. Well, plug-in city really being one high point of archigram. Not being any of it really built in England except a very small single pod designed in 1967. But archigram having such a worldwide influence, the name coming from telegram, it was supposed to be an architectural telegram, and it's quite true that they would send out archigram number 6 and 7. It would arrive in Argentina, for instance, and have more impact in Argentina than it would have across the street in London. That's how effective it was. So that you find kind of archigram-inspired things appearing in Spain on the roadside continuously in the late 60s and early 70s. Well, the awesome Rainer Banham, looking like Karl Marx and Ginsberg, cycling down the road in London on his mini-cycle, playing a very big role in this whole dialectical process. He's switching gears as fast as he can. According to his theory of quick obsolescence, he's always got to be up to the minute. So he stays with the avant-garde. He stays with the youth, unlike a lot of his friends who, as I've mentioned, think that they've gone too far and try to call meetings of the independent group and throw them out. Well, Banham, siding with the youth, therefore incurring the wrath of his generation. They call him the oldest living hippie, or a teenager. Well, Banham always been discovering some new principles about one thing or another. One of the first people to polemicize about the mini bike, discovered that you can bicycle through London from one end to the other almost without ever leaving parks and green spaces. If only you would connect them all up, you could have this low energy system and really make it a nice city. So he polemicizing on television about this and then putting forward his ideas of the unhouse, or the house that disappears, made up of a standard of living package here, which is transportable, and some kind of inflatable bubble, which, here's again primitivism, which the noble savages can take out to the desert of California and erect over the weekend and then leave. And then they can leave it and it will leave nothing there. He says this is the best kind of non-architecture. It leaves no artifactual deposits. It's a flexible one which is pure service and no status symbol, and doesn't pollute. So he hopes. So Banham pushing architecture in that direction in 1966. And Cedric Price, even a tougher, more wild version of Banham, a great friend of his. He dedicates the book on Los Angeles to Price. I seem to have wired myself up completely in this tortured discussion. Banham, Price, really an extraordinary character. I don't know how many of you have heard Cedric. He can be the funniest person around. He always has a cigar, his starched white collar, and black, gun black vest on, and very long hair pouring down around his perspiring face. Very witty man. Designs a series of schemes which are meant to send up everybody. They're meant to outrage, and they do outrage. The think belt, inventing this concept of a university that exists on a railroad, a disused railroad track. He says, let's reuse our railroads. And instead of having elite universities like Oxbridge and all of those things, or even the red brick ones, let's just design a service industry which can go out into an impoverished area and reuse the elements to teach the people in the Midlands who are poor how to make the best of their situation. Let's really use education to liberate these people. They don't need any acculturation. What they need is technology and knowledge. So the think belt is set up here with teaching areas here and living areas here in these stacks. The whole thing having a kind of utopian quality and really visual quality, which I think is very similar to Leonidov's schemes I showed you last time. In fact, Cedric Price is influenced by Leonidov consciously. You can see here that kind of technical idealist image. Well, this scheme, the think belt, has the final outrage with these 3 or 4 different kinds of housing. One called battery, after chicken batteries, like what you do with chickens. You put them in a factory farms. He says battery housing or sprawl housing. He says sprawl among the slag heaps. Sprawl in these mobile homes. It's as if you took the caravans right over here and said that's the ideal, except of course there aren't slag heaps around. So he gives the image which I and others have compared to a concentration camp, and he has accepted that comparison. I don't know whether he does ironically or happily or what. And he says, well, look, it's more brutalist than the brutalists. It's more he's trying to get away from even the slick tech imagery of archigram. And Price exerts a terrific force on English architecture because the English are always very reticent and aware of going too far with imagery, so that the moral power of Price is hard to overrate. He's I think kept it within a very circumscribed area. He attacks with his very witty vitriol. He attacks just about all the positions. He attacks the Newtown people. He attacks the brutalists, archigram, everyone. A building he actually built was this birdcage with Lord Snowdon. Another example of being influenced by constructivism. I think that building could have been produced in Russia in the 30s. Brilliant piece of structure. Now, a group that comes right out of Cedric and has this British love of the idea of architecture as a service, not an elitist thing, is the work of Norman Foster and Associates. They're a group of young designers in their 40s and 30s who produce these buildings that are basically elegant, really fantastically elegant sheds of warehouse space, one-story space, sandwich space, which is, in this case, under an inflatable. This was an inflatable office building designed in 1970 and blown up in 55 minutes. So the building, is a typical piece of Price thinking. It's you use a new technology only before that used on aircraft hangars and things like that, on those kind of buildings, researched by Foster and seen that, well, let's apply it to this IBM center or computer center because they need immediate office space and cheap space. So he can design and erect a building in 55 minutes, which costs a tenth of what another building will be, and it furthermore can come down, the next year when this computer company has had change in requirements. So in fact, it doesn't exist any longer. A building whose architecture is wonderfully white and alternates with these lighting booms, which support it in case of collapse, or has this open planning. Foster has made the most out of open planning, kind of red carpet on the ground. He's produced the Olsen shipping line, where he uses mirror plate in a wonderful way. This is 1971, so it's one of the first uses in England, in a way which I suppose is much more common in America. But he uses it to reflect the ships and create almost a wall painting of architecture. It's a building which has that ambiguity of something that's been painted on. His most famous building, two most famous, are the IBM Centre in Portsmouth of 1972, which does away with, or tries to do away with, the mullion and the remaining articulations. He hasn't quite got rid of the base. There's still some base there. There's not much roof. As you can see, there's only a half an inch of roof. And the mullions, the gaskets, are still there. But to all intents and purposes, it's a building that goes to infinity when viewed down its side, doubling reality. You see how it's just that side on that side, and creating these extraordinary ambiguous effects of being partly inside and partly outside. A perfect symbol for IBM, in a sense. The ultimate black box, a Rolls-Royce of modern technology. Strange things. I mean, that's an entrance, right? I mean, it must be a minor entrance, but the buildings of Foster being so reduced that they're buildings of absence. They lack a head, they lack a base, they lack gutters, doors, windows. I mean, if you think that's wall, then it's all wall, or if you think it's window, it's all window, but it lacks either the window or the wall. It doesn't have a roof. It doesn't have anything. It's just one thing. It's all one thing. And these very paradoxical situations. This one is his just completed black piano in Ipswich. It's the Willis Faber building. It's called the Black Piano because it's gigantic, snaking, round, black building. Very elegant. You can just barely make out here these slabs of space, which, when you see the interior photographs, are so sublime that they actually look like Mies van der Rohe's drawings. I mean, unlike a Mies building, they really look, they have that quality. Well, the Foster has followed Price, and in a sense is in the mainstream of the British, of one part of the British tradition, and Derek Walker has done the same thing, and Richard Rogers, who's doing the Place Beaubourg in Paris, and Farrell Grimshaw. So that there's emerging now what I call the London School of Architecture. It's based in London mostly, although Derek Walker has constructed Milton Keynes, this new town, out of it. It's very much like, I suppose, the work of the Silvers, or at least the work of Pelley and Lumsden, to a large extent, because it's pragmatic, it's pragmatism and really real estate, the most hard-headed, boring real estate forces being clothed in these very elegant packages of either reflective glass or, in this case, sheet steel covered in some kind of polyester. This is at Milton Keynes, another Milton Keynes one, or a building in the London School by Farrell and Grimshaw, the apartment building in London. Well, you can see the areas where this leads to kind of inappropriate building, and Milton Keynes has this work of Foster, which is his version of mass housing. Again, building which lacks everything almost, although you can make out a blue doorway and factory ribbon window here. A kind of pathetic attempt to make it into a house with this touch of personalization. Well, when Foster and the London School design housing, they invariably fall down. I mean, they produce semantic disasters. So what's happened recently, and where I'll end, is with the most recent turn of the screw is with this brilliant English architect, Ralph Erskine, who spent the last 30 years of his life on a boat in Sweden. So he's now really a Swedish English architect. Left England in the 30s to go to Sweden in a kind of the dream of the ultimate socialist state. Goes there as a conscientious objector, becomes involved with anarchism, ends up starting his own practice in Sweden, and then re-importing himself to Britain, where he's become the architect of the moment now. He's designed many housing schemes. Unfortunately, I can't show you his best, which is the housing in Byker, outside of Newcastle, the famous Byker Wall, which is this curvilinear wall that goes up the hill, the longest mosaic in Europe, 2 or 3 miles of curving brick. It's extraordinary in many different colors. And then behind that wall, lots of low housing. He's pulling together many strands I've been talking about. First of all, you can see its relation to the People's Detailing and the William Morris arts and crafts tradition. It's small brick housing here. But he's going much beyond it. I mean, he's using the kind of the vernacular language in a creative way, so that it's not just a back monotonous housing, nor is it just a kind of pattern book or cliches. It's a very nice urban articulation of that. Here's a back pedestrian street where such things as the stoop and the garbage place and entry are marked. And actually, one of the few pictures I've shown all evening with people in it, actually people live in these things. He's reintroduced a lot of things that the British hold dear. For instance, the back garden. These semi-private or semi-public spaces, which are very important in housing, at least in English housing. The English have more gardens than any other nation in the world, even more than the Dutch. And so, Erskine saying, all right, well, I can't provide it for everybody, but I will provide it for a few, because that will at least make these other areas that might be vandalized more personal. So he designs Milton Keynes housing in an ad hoc aesthetic of wood and throwaway timber and cheap engineering brick, and creates very nice spaces, urban spaces with it. And other architects design in a kind of neo-Victorian manner. This is the famous scheme of Darburn and Dark in Pimlico, started in 1961, wins the competition in 1961, and really illustrates almost all the Jane Jacobite points. It keeps old buildings, a famous church here by Butterfield, 19th century church. It has a mixture of uses. It has corner pubs, libraries, collective facilities, laundries, and so on. Not just housing, and it has old age areas, old age homes. All of that with incorporating old trees, new trees, mostly new trees, and very nice urban space. So this is what a lot of people in England feel is the direction to look at. But as I say, it's Erskine who's really manages to capture the imagination, and a scheme which is rather nice is his Clare College in Cambridge, scheme which still uses modern elements, parabolas, extended structural elements, but uses them in an amusing way. For instance, when you come around, you come down the stairs of this is another dormitory in Cambridge, walk around and you see a series of architectural jokes, the most sort of obvious one being this, brick cantilever that goes out 12 feet but doesn't go the last foot and meets the other side, just to mark the entrance. So actually Erskine not afraid to use a kind of whimsy and ad hoc aesthetic. So we're back, in a sense, to what Peter Cook has said is good and has predicted for kind of ad hoc transformation of suburbia. And it's finding its justification in another way through garbage housing. This is a phrase and book of Martin Pauly, who comes to America to build Budweiser houses out of throwaway technologies, throwaway things like record covers. And he finds out, for instance, that I don't know how many bricks made a year. There are 40 million bricks made a year, but there are 8 billion beer cans a year thrown away. So, beer cans of the world unite. But the last shot I'll end with is not that so much, but looking at the ideal home exhibition, because this is ultimately where mass culture and the British architecture is at. 75% of council housing is brick and 2 or 3 stories, and the codes that it's based on are codes which come from a traditional past, so that at the moment, you can make all of these things out of fiberglass. The whole thing can be put up very cheaply, so that all the arguments of modern architecture on mass production, mass culture, prefabrication, and reaching a large audience have now kind of themselves turned and are being seen by some people as at least having relevance in these terms, so that people in Britain are studying, if you like, the industrial vernacular of pop architecture in a very straightforward manner, trying to see in what ways they can use these forces and traditions to create an architecture that is both acceptable on a mass cultural level and creative on a, say, on a high cultural level. That's the end of that marathon. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to.
I'm sorry you didn't show the low-rise housing tendencies for Olivetti.
Why?
Well, the views you showed, were very desolate, but the day we spent there last summer was a beautiful sunny day.
Yeah.
And it was crowded.
Was it?
We had fish and chips on.
Really? Yeah.
And mothers were walking their babies.
I think it was very nice too. Yeah.
I mean, it was a whole different view of it.
Yes,
Than
yes.
high-rise and deserted pedestrian crossovers. We were not impressed with it. It was a new space.
I think it's an awfully seductive space, that lake area with sailboats. It's absolutely ideal. But it's like 2 different places. But the reality. Well, no, I mean, it's still nice. It's nice to have it. But the reality of the Thamesmead thing is very strange, in the sense that it's been so interviewed and so many people have come to it that the inhabitants, were they rioting when you were there? No?
It was a very peaceful afternoon.
Was it? Okay. Well, some of them are protesting against the price they have to pay and the lack of amenities, and they would prefer to go back to other kind of council housing. So it's become a political issue. It's a very tough one. I mean, I'm sure that'll die down. That's just maybe momentary.
It's current.
But it's current now, yeah. And it's caused in part by the high rise, I think.
What is Archigram doing?
Archigram is very, I think it's dissipated. It's kind of collective energy. And Peter is doing his own thing, which, as I mentioned, amounts to lumps and sponges and other esoteric ideas. He's trying to just push himself and his aesthetic too far, always. He really believes in that now. In order to innovate. In a way, Peter's the last of the avant-garde who still believes in creative emancipation. And yet he's run out of things that he can create. Well, he doesn't really believe so much in emancipation, but he believes that, creativity is all. And so, but his creativity isn't as strong as it was, and he's just almost ringing the changes, I think. That's my personal feeling. But he commands a great following still in England, although perhaps a greater attack now. I mean, if you go to, the students aren't, well, he can still pull them out. This is the left wing at the AA and the left wing around Britain are very bitter about the fact that Peter will come on and pull this crowd of 700, and they'll polemicize for weeks and get a crowd of 10. So, in spite of the fact that I don't think that really anyone.
Is
sounds like he's not the left wing anymore.
Oh, he never was.
Well, maybe the avant-garde.
He was the avant-garde, but he was never left-wing. Peter's sympathies are with socialism, but he's not leftist. And in fact, he spent the last 5 years baiting the left wing for its humorlessness. And it's funny.
Maybe he's the Yippie of Britain.
Yes, that's good.
Well, what about the rest of them? They're all just sort of...
They're doing a little bit here and there. Ron Heron's designed a thing at Milton Keynes. Their first building's going to be underground, actually. It's going to be a shelter. Yeah, it's nothing.
Well, but that's keeping with some of the things we're underground.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But it's a kind of pale imitation of what they were graphically, you know. In a way, it's very sad that England is so hard on the avant-garde. England has no time for the avant-garde. It really doesn't. Well, in America, I think there's much more of it. Yes, but still, it's much more accepted. And whereas in Japan, of course, the avant-garde is not only accepted, but it's on television, and they're heroes. In England, they really don't like it at all. So.
Do you think that Graham had
Oh yeah, I think Expo 70. Yeah, I'll show that actually in the future. In Japan, the way in which it's they acknowledge that it's plug-in city, in a way. Yeah.
Well, there's one building that's almost
superficially at least, it's almost like a copy of what the program is. Like a tower.
Right.
It appeared as like a drawing.
Yes. Yeah.
And when Sterling was here, he in his talk he said that he didn't want to be co-opted by the rationalists, or implied he didn't want to be. Yet when he showed those two competitions, they were almost indistinguishable in attitude, it seems to me, from the work that Matthias Unger showed of the same competition, one of them earlier in the year.
Really? Yeah.
And what do you think he's up to? Because it seems like the way he's using kind of sort of historical references and such is completely different than the way he uses, say, Cambridge faculty, history faculty.
Yeah. I think that he has changed very much. He spoke in that talk about what he called the Stalinist reaction against modern architecture, and he's the major scapegoat of that, and he doesn't understand it. He caricatures it. He sees, say, the work of Ralph Erskine as Tinker Toy. He said, what is it, something in Naughty Land, the fooling around of. He was the one who characterized the people's detailing, the Marxist detailing, as by saying, let's face it, William Morris was a Swede. He made all of these very witty comments attacking that. And so now that it's re-emerged 20 years later, and it attacks him, he doesn't understand that it's different now than it was then. So his way of coping with that is to become historicist, or to use historical references. And that's part of a general trend of the time anyway, especially in Europe, not so much in this country, but in Europe, everybody now is going backwards and trying to accept a mixed language. So that, for instance, did you notice that pediments appear in that scheme? There's an actual classical but stripped pediment, and there's a phony wall in the 19th century German style. And then he uses Schinkel.
And the Villa Rotundi.
And the Villa Rotunda. There's even Albert Speer, a bit of Albert Speer Nazi architecture in that, if you look in the sunken areas. The only bit of Jim Sterling that remains in that scheme in Dusseldorf is actually a piece of patent glazing that curves, and it's in the shape of a hand, if you look. So everything else of the old Jim Sterling is gone, except that, which is an incredible turnabout. But I don't think it's rationalist necessarily. It's Jim's personal way of being very complex and historically conscious. And he refuses to. I've talked to him at length about, the importance of looking at popular language and using plastic Corinthian columns, and he said, "Not for me, Charles. Forget it." So he refuses to go the next step. So when he uses traditional language, it's going to be very elitist and very rare. Very good. I think his Dusseldorf scheme is almost the best thing he's ever produced. It's beautiful, circle and square and ironies. I hate the facades, but the planning is unbelievably interesting. The sequence of space and ambiguities.
I wonder if he's just flirting with that. I asked him if he had abandoned his industrial glass aesthetic, and he said not necessarily.
Oh, really?
Yes, and he was interested in reactions to that.
Yeah.
Someone said
whatever
that Leon
happened to the-
Greer might have affected something.
Yeah. I mean, Leon Creer did affect it, and that's what he and Leon have had a contretemps. So, you don't cross a Scotsman, no. Anything?
I wanted to ask you a question. Do you know what happened to the competition for the AA building? It was supposed to be a new building, and
Well, the AA didn't get the money and decided not to build it, decided not to move. And so there was no...
how about the one for the Houses of Parliament? Do you know what happened to that?
Well, that was run by a firm, and then in typical British style, they decided to do nothing for a while, and then it became so expensive with inflation that they got a reason for doing nothing, and now they decided they don't like it anyway. It's too modern and, doesn't fit in with, it's not right. It's not in the National Perpendicular Gothic style. Yeah? That's,
I don't know the exact name, the last sort of things you were pushing in terms of...
Ralph Erskine?
Ralph Erskine, yeah.
Yeah.
And you seem to have sort of an appreciation for this. And I wondered, my first reaction was like, we have a lot of things like that here done, and it's been happening for a long time. And although there might be the pop indication, I wondered what really you saw in it. I mean, you talk about urban spaces, but as a...
Well, it's very difficult because I meant to show the biker wall scheme, but I didn't have slides of it. And that scheme is very important, not just for the aesthetic, but because Erskine worked with the inhabitants and introduced a kind of participation which isn't just piety. He actually established his office on the site, got in an old funeral parlor. He and his wife sold trees and flowers and things like that. And his firm started acting as a lost and found and a consulting agency. And so he managed to catalyze and get the confidence of this community of 5,000 or 6,000, 8,000 actually people. He interviewed them all and said, now how many of you want to stay? 80% of them said they wanted to stay, so he rehoused them. He said, where do you want to live and who do you want to live next to? And through this process, and it's really a process which is fascinating, you see that it produces an architecture which is more in tune with the aesthetic and cultural codes of its area, and actually changes the community in doing that. So it's the process I should have described, actually, as well as the formal inventiveness. And the slides I showed really didn't get even the informal inventiveness over, but there's this very long wall which masks out the noise of the highway. And there are a lot of nice details and so on. So I recommend that you read about Erskine, maybe, to understand. It's been published in December Architectural Review in December 1975. Was it? Or December 74? I can't remember. But a very long article, very good article by Colin Amory in Architectural Review. Yeah, on it. That will maybe answer some way the question.
Was that actually inexpensive solution?
It was very economic. It was very, very economic. Yeah, quite. Absolutely. I mean, within the ad hoc aesthetic, he uses old material, and he'll use whatever's at hand. So, not whatever, but a lot of.
So it wasn't a case of just looking cheap, actually. Right?
Actually, was cheap. Yeah.
Money.
Yeah, money-wise, in real money.
It didn't seem very inventive, or it seemed rather prosaic.
The shots I showed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe that, I mean, in a way, I think one has to accept that, prosaicness as a positive aspect of the situation. That, for housing particularly, it should be prosaic. It should be built in codes that are straightforward and just traditional. And maybe only inventive in, say, urban space and in detail, rather than having fantastically new facades or so on. It's an informal, low-keyed, prosaic inventiveness, very much in the picturesque tradition, but
Swedish tradition.
and Swedish too, yeah. Whereas, it's different from public buildings, but I think for housing, it's a good approach, and one that is not followed really in this country, I don't think, by people like Venturi and Moore, in spite of the fact that they do talk about the need for vernacular. They are always trying very hard to be clever and succeeding, but at times, even though Venturi talks about being ordinary, he seems not to be able to do it so much. His ordinariness is always very tight. I'll show that, I guess, on Friday, some of it. Okay? I really timed myself up.
You're amazing.
That was funny. I didn't realize, but look at
That was
those.
great. I told Maggie we're going to have to go back and see all that stuff we didn't see.
We haven't seen the Bible. Erskine's just very interested in that. Because he said,
I really would like to see all that.
Another question about that last, about that.
There's a lot of studies going
Well, what it ends up is
psychological.
but it's good enough.